In a world where money buys anything, no one could save the billionaire on the brink of death. Not his doctors, not his wealth. But in the silence of his mansion, a poor black maid performed a miracle. With ancient knowledge passed down through generations, she defied the odds and did what no one else could. The question is, what happens when the most powerless person becomes the one with the power to change everything? Xavier Westmore was a name known across the globe. A self-made billionaire, his empire stretched from real estate to cutting-edge technology, touching every facet of life for those lucky enough to work in or near his orbit. To the world, Xavier was a symbol of success, a man who had conquered everything with his wealth and business acumen. But behind the polished veneer of his high-rise office and luxury estate, there was a man consumed by his own mortality. In his grand estate, a mansion perched atop the hills overlooking the city, Xavier's sickness was becoming more than a private concern. His health had begun to deteriorate rapidly, and the finest doctors had all but given up. A rare disease, untreatable by modern medicine, had slowly overtaken him. Despite his vast fortune, there was nothing that could stop the progression of his illness. Wealth and power had failed him when it mattered most. Amara, on the other hand, had never known such luxuries. A poor black woman from a humble neighborhood, she had worked as a maid in the Westmore estate for the past 5 years. Her quiet demeanor and steady hands had earned her the respect of the other staff, though her place in the mansion was always defined by her station, beneath the rich, invisible in their world of excess. She was a stranger to wealth, but that did not mean she was unfamiliar with power. Amara came from a long line of healers. Her grandmother had taught her the ways of ancient remedies, methods passed down through generations, rooted in natural herbs and spiritual practices. But this was a secret no one knew, and certainly not the powerful family who owned the estate. She was just a maid, an invisible worker in their world, until one fateful night when Xavier's life was on the line, and the only one who could save him was the woman everyone had overlooked. The mansion was quiet that evening, a stillness that felt wrong. The hum of high-end medical machines was the only sound breaking the silence, a stark contrast to the usual hum of servants and family chatter. Xavier Westmore, once the embodiment of power, lay unconscious in his bed, surrounded by a team of physicians. They were focused, their brows furrowed in concentration, but no amount of technology could save him. His pulse had weakened, and his breathing was shallow. The doctors, despite their best efforts, had run out of options. "This is beyond us," one of the physicians said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Westmore. We've done all we can." A hushed murmur passed through the room. The tension was palpable. Xavier's wife, a woman accustomed to the world of opulence and influence, stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes filled with tears but also disbelief. She wasn't ready to let go of her husband, the man who had been her world. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that she would have to. Amara stood by the door, unnoticed by most. Her role, as always, was to quietly maintain the estate, never to intervene in matters beyond her work. Her responsibilities were simple: clean, serve, remain invisible. But this night was different. She had seen the doctors' reactions, their helplessness, and she had felt a strange sense of urgency pulse through her, something primal. For a moment she closed her eyes, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But when she opened them, she looked at Xavier in a way she never had before. He was a man she had served, a man who treated her as little more than an invisible part of his estate, yet now he was on the brink of death. Her grandmother's teachings echoed in her mind. The ancient remedies, the healing rituals, the knowledge of herbs and spiritual practices, it all rushed back in an instant. She had never dared to use this knowledge on someone so important, so powerful. It had always been something hidden, passed down through generations in her family, whispered about by those who knew the old ways. But this was something else entirely. Could she save him? Could she, a lowly maid, perform a miracle no one else could? Amara took a deep breath, and in that moment, she knew she had no choice. She had been called. But by who? And for what purpose? Was it fate or something more mystical that had led her to this very moment where she stood in a room filled with powerful people, preparing to do something no one could explain. Without waiting for permission, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. She moved quietly, but with purpose, her mind focused solely on what she had to do. Her hands, steady despite the gravity of the situation, reached for the small bundle of herbs hidden in the folds of her apron. She had always kept them with her, though they were never meant to be used in a place like this, with people like them. But the time had come. As she began preparing the mixture, Amara's thoughts raced. Was this madness? To act as though she could save a man whose wealth had once seemed unreachable, whose power had dwarfed her own existence? She could feel the eyes of the room on her, even if they weren't yet speaking. Xavier's wife, his children, his staff, they all watched her, the lowly maid, moving as if she had the answers. But what if she did? Amara recited a quiet prayer under her breath as she worked, her hands trembling only slightly. This was no ordinary night. Something hung in the air, an invisible thread pulling her forward. She could feel it deep within her, this connection to a deeper force, a force that had always been within her, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The doctors continued to whisper among themselves, unsure whether to call it a night and let Xavier slip away quietly, or to try one last desperate measure. But Amara wasn't waiting for them to make up their minds. As she held the mixture in her hands, she placed it gently on Xavier's forehead, the warmth of his skin pressing against her palms. The silence in the room deepened. What would happen next? Would Xavier, the man whose life was hanging by a thread, truly survive? Or was Amara, in her desperate attempt to help, simply pushing the inevitable a little further into the unknown? As the minutes passed, the room remained still, everyone frozen in anticipation. The tension grew, thickening the air, as if time itself had come to a standstill. Amara stood there, feeling the weight of every eye on her. But she no longer cared. For the first time in her life, she was no longer a maid in a mansion. She was someone with the power to change a man's fate. But would it be enough? The mystery had begun. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Amara stood still by Xavier's side, watching with an intensity that seemed to electrify the room. The mixture of herbs lay cool against the billionaire's forehead, and she could feel a strange energy flowing between them. The tension was unbearable. The doctors, who had initially watched in disbelief, were now too stunned to intervene. Xavier's wife, Caroline, paced the room, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "This is nonsense. You're just a maid. You have no place doing this." Amara didn't answer. She knew that to speak now would only undermine the ancient rituals she was performing. Her heart raced, but her hands remained steady, a calmness rooted in something older than this mansion, older than the wealth Xavier had accumulated. The mixture of herbs had begun to warm in her palms, and Amara knew this was the critical moment. She closed her eyes, drawing on everything she had learned from her grandmother. The chanting came softly, almost unintelligible, but it filled the room with a quiet power that none could deny. But the tension grew. Caroline's voice cut through the air again. "This is absurd. You're not going to save him. You're just wasting time." Her words were filled with desperation, and the room felt heavy with her frustration. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep sense of entitlement, as though Xavier's life was somehow her right to control. As Caroline stormed over to the bedside, demanding that Amara stop, the billionaire's breath faltered. It was faint, a shallow gasp, but it sent a jolt of panic through the room. The doctors rushed forward, checking the machines, whispering urgently to each other. "He's slipping," one of the doctors said quietly. "I think it's too late." Xavier's family, still in disbelief, started to gather around the bed, pushing Amara aside. "Step back," one of them ordered, his voice sharp, filled with a mixture of authority and fear. But Amara refused to step away. She stepped closer instead, her gaze fixed on Xavier's weakened form. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the pull toward something greater than what she had known. It was as though time itself had come to a halt. In the midst of the rising chaos, a deep internal conflict roiled within Amara. She was doing this for Xavier, yes, but she was also doing it for herself. She had spent her entire life serving others, living in the shadows, being overlooked. Her family had always known this kind of healing, but no one had ever trusted them with the power to save someone as important as Xavier. Was she overstepping? Was she using a power she didn't fully understand? But as she stood there, looking down at the man who had once been too busy for even a glance in her direction, she realized something profound. The difference between them wasn't their worth, but the opportunities they'd had. She had been ignored, invisible, but her knowledge, this ancient healing, was something that transcended wealth and power. The moment she applied the final touch to his forehead, she felt something shift. The pulse in Xavier's neck, weak, faint, began to quicken. A flutter, like the tiniest spark of life returning. She could feel his body responding to the ancient remedy, and for the first time she dared to believe this could work. But then the room erupted into chaos. "Enough!" Caroline screamed. "You've gone too far!" Her words stung, but Amara didn't flinch. She knew she was doing the right thing. She had no desire for power, for the money or status that Xavier's recovery might bring her. But her mind had become clear. The tension in the room, the voices shouting, the fear that laced every corner, it all fell away. It wasn't about Xavier's family or their entitlement. It was about something much larger than them. Xavier's breath deepened, though still shallow. A faint murmur escaped his lips, almost inaudible. Amara stood there, her pulse racing, watching. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice. Xavier's life was no longer in the hands of the doctors or his family. It was in her hands, and she would not let them take it from her. The room fell into an eerie silence as everyone gathered around him. The doctors stepped back, confused and helpless. It was Amara's moment to take control of the situation, to show them all what they had overlooked. But the tension was thick, and the stakes were higher than ever. The billionaire's life was in her hands, and it was unclear whether she could truly save him or if this miracle would soon turn to tragedy. Xavier's breath was shallow but steady. The room, which had been filled with uncertainty and frustration, seemed to hold its collective breath. Amara stood at the edge of the bed, watching closely as her hands worked their magic, applying the last traces of the herbal mixture to Xavier's fevered forehead. It felt surreal. For a moment, it was as though everything else, his wealth, his power, his family, didn't matter. In the stillness, there was just Xavier's life, hanging by a thread, and her hands, guided by ancient knowledge, holding that thread in place. For the briefest of moments, it felt like victory was slipping through her fingers. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Caroline, Xavier's wife, had already called for the doctors to take over. She couldn't see what Amara saw, couldn't understand the energy shifting around them. Her voice rose, demanding that Amara step away from her husband, her eyes filled with the kind of fury that only the threatened rich could muster. But Amara stood firm. She had been invisible in this house for so long, her entire existence reduced to a servant, an afterthought. But now she was the one who held the power, the same power that had been passed down through generations in her family. She had never believed in the magic of her grandmother's teachings until now. As she stood there, the world around her seemed to blur. Everything except Xavier, his life, and her purpose. This was no longer just about saving him. It was about finding her place in a world that had always rejected her. A deep breath escaped Amara as she finally stepped back, her hands falling to her sides. The entire room was holding its breath, eyes fixed on Xavier, waiting for any sign, any indication that he was truly alive. A doctor stepped forward, his face pale and weary. He checked the machines, his fingers moving over the readings with practiced precision. The others in the room, Xavier's family, the staff, even the doctors, watched as though the outcome would determine the fate of all their lives. And then it happened. Xavier's chest rose sharply, a deep, rasping breath that seemed to push through the silence like a wave crashing against the shore. His eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest of moments, his gaze locked onto Amara's. It was a look that no one else in the room saw, but she did. It was as though in that instant, Xavier saw her, not just the maid, but the woman who had saved him. He whispered something, barely audible, but Amara heard it. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Amara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to speak at all. She hadn't expected anything from him. She was just doing what she had always done, helping, giving, serving. But in that moment, she realized that Xavier's question wasn't just a query about his survival, it was about everything she had been to him, everything she had been to this world. Before she could answer, Caroline rushed forward, her face a mask of relief and disbelief. "You're alive!" she cried, clutching Xavier's hand. "Thank God!" Her tears were not just of joy, but also of overwhelming shock. No one had believed it was possible, not even Xavier's doctors. But Amara remained calm, her emotions in check. The emotional storm she had been carrying inside since the moment she made the decision to act, this was the climax of it all. She had saved him, but at what cost? Xavier's eyes began to search the room, confused and dazed. His gaze, at first unfocused, slowly turned toward Amara. Caroline noticed and snapped her fingers in front of Xavier's face, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Xavier, focus! Stay with us!" But Xavier didn't respond to her. He wasn't looking at Caroline. He was looking at Amara. In that moment, everything seemed to stand still. The tension that had been building from the start, the weight of Amara's decision, the power dynamics shifting before her eyes, came to a head. She had been invisible, unimportant for so long. Now, Xavier Westmore, the man who had never once acknowledged her existence beyond her duties, was staring at her. His life, the one that had seemed so out of her reach, was now in her hands. But it wasn't just about the physical life he had been given back. It was about something deeper, something that she couldn't yet name. "What do you want from me?" Xavier's voice rasped, almost inaudible. Amara stood motionless, her heart pounding, not knowing how to answer. The room was silent, waiting. Xavier's gaze held her, the intensity of his stare almost unbearable. For the first time, he saw her, not as a servant, not as a maid, but as something more, something capable of saving him. It was in that moment that Amara understood the true magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just saved a billionaire. She had shifted the balance of power, of perception, of reality itself. But now the real test was coming. Xavier would live, but how would he see her now? How would they all see her? Would she remain in her place, forever the invisible woman, or would the world finally recognize her for what she was? The silence in the room was deafening. The tension, the unspoken conflict between them, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Amara could feel the weight of her actions, the stakes rising higher with every passing second. The emotional climax had come, and there was no turning back. The billionaire had been saved, but nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Xavier's miraculous recovery were filled with tension. Amara had saved his life, an act that had shifted the very foundations of power within the Westmore estate, but now the consequences of that act were beginning to unfold. Xavier's condition had stabilized, but his mind was clouded with confusion, and his emotions seemed erratic. The man who had been unreachable, untouchable, was now vulnerable, and that vulnerability made him question everything about his life, the people around him, the life he had built, and the very system that had kept him at the top. Amara, once invisible, was now the center of a new, unsettling dynamic. Xavier's recovery had only made her presence more undeniable, and as the days passed, the weight of his gratitude, or perhaps his guilt, began to manifest in strange ways. Xavier, ever the enigma, refused to speak about his recovery in front of his family. He barely acknowledged his wife, Caroline, as she rushed to care for him, her face a mix of relief and unspoken anger. But Amara was never far away. She continued with her duties, careful not to draw attention to the shift in the balance between them. As the tension in the mansion grew, so did the whispers behind closed doors. Xavier's family had always seen him as their lifeline, the man whose wealth provided them with everything they needed. They didn't know what to make of the new power dynamics that seemed to be unfolding, and they resented the fact that someone like Amara, a woman from nothing, now seemed to hold sway over the very man they had worshipped for so long. The first real confrontation came a week after Xavier's recovery, when Caroline, unable to contain her frustrations, called Amara into the study. Xavier sat at his desk, staring out of the large bay window, his face unreadable. Caroline's voice was sharp, and her hands shook as she gestured for Amara to sit. You've done what no one else could, Caroline began, her voice brittle. You've saved him. But don't think for a second that you have any place here. This is my house, and Xavier is my husband. You are a maid, Amara. Don't forget that. Amara had heard the threat in Caroline's voice, but she didn't flinch. She knew the game Caroline was playing. She had lived under the constant gaze of the Westmore family for years. Always obedient. Always invisible. But now, for the first time, she felt something stir inside her, a realization that no matter how much the world around her tried to keep her in her place, she had power. She had saved Xavier's life, and that was a power that no one could take from her. I saved him because it was the right thing to do, Amara replied calmly, her voice steady. Not because of your money or status. I did it because I could. Caroline's face twisted in disbelief, and for a moment it seemed like she might lash out. But Xavier's voice broke through the tension, low and commanding. Enough, Caroline. Both women turned to see Xavier standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't the same man he had been before. He looked at Amara with a mixture of gratitude and something darker, perhaps guilt, perhaps confusion. But there was no denying the way he was beginning to see her as someone more than just a maid. I need to talk to you, Amara, Xavier said, his voice steady but heavy. Alone. Caroline's face contorted with frustration, but she said nothing. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the study, leaving Amara and Xavier alone in the thickening silence. Xavier motioned for Amara to sit, and she did so, though she could feel her heart racing. Was this the moment when everything would change? Would Xavier finally speak the words that had been hanging between them like an unspoken promise? Or was this just another game, another layer of the illusion he had always created? I don't understand, Xavier began, his voice rough. I don't understand why you saved me. You're not like the people in my world. You've always been different. You've always been invisible to me. Amara swallowed the lump in her throat, her mind racing for a response. How could she explain the depth of her actions? How could she tell him that in saving him, she hadn't just saved a billionaire, but had also saved herself? Because it was never about you, Amara said quietly. It was about something deeper, something that I've known all my life. I have a gift, Xavier, and when I saw you there dying, I knew I had to use it. I didn't do it for your wealth or your family. I did it because I couldn't watch a life fade away when I had the power to stop it. Xavier's gaze softened, but the intensity in his eyes grew. He was trying to understand, to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the woman who had just turned his world upside down. And now what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from me, Amara? Amara hesitated, the weight of his question hanging between them. What did she want? She didn't want his money, his status, or his pity. She didn't need any of that. All she wanted was respect, recognition for the person she had always been, even when no one had seen her. I don't want anything from you, she replied, her voice firm. I've never wanted anything, but I won't be invisible anymore, Xavier, not to you and not to anyone. For a long moment, Xavier said nothing. His eyes flickered with something, recognition, understanding, perhaps even admiration. But before he could speak, the door to the study swung open, and Caroline stood in the doorway, her face a mask of anger. Xavier, she said sharply, her voice thick with contempt, you're not thinking clearly. You don't owe her anything. She's just a maid. Xavier turned to face his wife, the words hanging in the air between them like an explosive charge ready to detonate. The crisis had arrived. Xavier was no longer the man he had once been, and the question of what Amara had truly awakened within him was about to break open everything he had known. The turning point was here. Everything was changing, and nothing would ever be the same again. Xavier stood frozen, caught between the two women, his wife, who embodied everything he had built his life around, and Amara, the maid who had defied all expectations and saved him in a moment of death's grasp. The tension in the room was palpable, like a pressure building up in the air, threatening to snap any second. Caroline's angry stare cut through the silence, while Amara stood silently, her gaze unwavering. Xavier, you can't be serious. Caroline's voice trembled with frustration. You've been saved by a maid. Someone who has no place in this world. She's just a servant, someone who is meant to stay in the shadows. What is this nonsense? Xavier looked at his wife, then back at Amara. His gaze softened as he met her eyes. In those deep, dark eyes, he saw something he hadn't recognized before: strength, determination, and a wisdom that transcended all the wealth and power he had ever accumulated. She wasn't just a maid. She was someone who had seen through the world he had built, someone who could reach past his facade of success and see him for who he truly was, a man who had always been afraid of vulnerability. Amara had saved him, yes, but it was more than that. She had shown him that there was more to life than power and money. She had stripped him of his invincibility, forcing him to confront the emptiness that came with living a life where wealth and status were everything. Caroline's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "This is ridiculous. Are you really going to throw away everything we have for someone like her?" Xavier's eyes narrowed, and he stepped away from his wife, his movements deliberate. He felt the weight of her words, but it no longer mattered. He had spent his entire life building a fortress around himself, surrounding himself with people who reinforced his belief that wealth was everything. But Amara had shown him that there was more to life than what he could touch or own. "No, Caroline," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not throwing away everything we have. I'm finally starting to understand what really matters." Amara's breath caught in her throat. For the first time since her grandmother had taught her the ancient healing methods, Amara felt seen. Not for the color of her skin or the station she held in the Westmore estate, but for who she truly was, a person of worth, capable of great things. Xavier turned back to Amara, his eyes filled with a newfound respect. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice softer now, carrying an emotion he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. "I don't know what I would have done without you." For a moment, Amara remained silent, struggling to find the words that would convey everything she felt in that instant. She had saved him, yes, but she had also saved herself in the process. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, refusing to remain invisible any longer. "You don't need to thank me, Xavier," Amara replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't save you for your money, your empire, or your power. I saved you because life is too precious to throw away. No matter who you are, no one should die when they don't have to." Xavier nodded, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "I've spent my whole life building walls around myself, thinking that my wealth could protect me from everything. But I was wrong. It wasn't wealth or power that saved me. It was something far deeper." He paused, his gaze lingering on Amara. "It was you." The room seemed to hold its breath as Xavier made a decision that would change everything. He turned back to Caroline, who was standing there, her face filled with disbelief. "Caroline," Xavier said, his voice shaking with finality, "I can't continue living like this. I've spent too many years chasing something that doesn't matter. I've hurt you, and I've hurt myself. I've ignored what's real." He looked at Amara again, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "I'm going to make things right. I'm going to change. I don't know what that means yet, but I'm going to start by being honest, with myself and with you." Caroline's expression shifted from anger to a cold, calculating stare. "What are you saying, Xavier?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "I'm saying that I can't live for the illusion anymore," he replied, his voice clear and resolute. "I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not the man I used to be, and I'm not going to let my wealth define who I am any longer. I've been blind to what really matters in life." Xavier turned fully toward Amara, his gaze softer now, filled with a depth of understanding he hadn't felt before. "You've taught me that. You've shown me that the real power doesn't come from money. It comes from connection, from empathy, and from knowing who you truly are." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the transformation taking place. Xavier Westmore, once the untouchable billionaire, was no longer the man he had been. His decision had not only changed the trajectory of his own life, but had also shaken the foundation of everything he had ever believed in. Caroline, seeing the finality in Xavier's eyes, didn't say another word. The silence between them spoke volumes, but it was a silence that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Xavier turned back to Amara, his voice quiet but filled with newfound respect. Amara, I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for saving me, but for showing me the truth. Amara nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she had been seen, not for the first time, but for the right reasons. And in that moment, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation had taken place. The man who had once been trapped by his own wealth was now free. And Amara, the woman who had once been invisible, was now standing at the forefront of a new reality, one where power no longer came from money, but from the choices we make and the people we choose to be. The days that followed Xavier's decision were filled with an overwhelming sense of change, but they also brought a kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. The mansion, once a symbol of his empire and success, felt different now, less like a fortress and more like a home. He no longer measured his worth by his wealth, but by the connections he had with those around him. And for the first time, Xavier felt truly alive, not because of his business dealings or the luxury surrounding him, but because of his ability to make a real difference in the lives of those who mattered most. Xavier's relationship with Caroline had changed irrevocably. The distance between them, once filled with the unspoken truths of a loveless marriage, had only grown. Caroline, unable to reconcile the new Xavier with the man she had once known, chose to leave the mansion. She packed her things in silence, her departure marked by a bitter resignation. There were no dramatic arguments, no final words. Xavier had already made his decision, and Caroline knew that no matter how much she clung to the remnants of their life, it would never be the same. Amara, too, had changed. She had once believed that she was nothing more than an invisible servant, but now the world had shifted in her favor. Xavier, despite his family's disapproval, made it clear that she was no longer just the maid. He respected her, valued her, and acknowledged the power she had to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He asked for her guidance, not as a servant, but as an equal. In the end, Amara remained in the mansion, but it was no longer her place of servitude. It was a symbol of her own transformation, a place where she could breathe freely, where her knowledge was respected, and where she was seen for who she truly was. The mansion's corridors no longer echoed with the tension of unspoken power dynamics. They were filled with a quiet understanding, the kind that only comes when people see each other for who they are, not for their status or wealth, but for their humanity. Xavier and Amara stood side by side, not as master and maid, but as two individuals who had been brought together by fate, each of them forever changed by the other. The world around them had shifted, but the most profound change was the one that had occurred within them. Xavier had learned the true meaning of humility, and Amara had learned that she was worthy of respect and love. They had both found something far more valuable than wealth, a shared sense of purpose, and in that they had found their peace.